Morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. I know that's the beginning of summer. You wouldn't know that, waking up this morning, summer vacation at least, for many students that we have here and a few other students that maybe are in college most of the year and somewhere else. That's kind of been on my mind in preparing this lesson. And I want you to open up to James chapter 4 and verse 13. And of course, while you're turning over there, I'll just pause for a moment and just want to remind everybody that we have a youth Bible forum that we're doing again this year. We did it last year. We're going to do it again this year with Josh Higgins, same speaker, and that'll be June 14th. That's a Saturday at 5 p.m., and that's for basically high school to middle school to high school students. And so if you have somebody that's in middle or high school, we'd love to have them for that, and it's always good to get the young people together so they can be encouraged by each other's faith and know that there's other young people out there that think the way they do. And so hopefully you can make it for that. And so that's June 14th. He'll also be speaking for us on the following Sunday as well, June 15th. And so, but I want to go ahead and read James chapter 4 and verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. I couldn't help but think of the marriage relationship when I read this because not that any spouses have done this in this auditorium, but how many of us as men have maybe set out to make plans and we organize maybe to have somebody over or to go do something? Or imagine making some major decision, right? Like buying a house, or you took a promotion and it's going to force your family to relocate. How many people have made those major decisions without consulting their spouses, right? And a lot of times we do it because we say something like, well, we've been married for so long, I think I know what they would want me to say and what their answer would be in this situation. And those are always the famous last words, aren't they? And of course, we know what's so hurtful. Probably all husbands have made that mistake at least once, and wives too, probably. And we know what's so hurtful about that is because we forgot about them. That we just make these plans, especially when they're important, and we didn't find it valuable enough to get their input before making a big decision. We can do the same thing in our relationship with God. That we have this pattern, this habit of just totally forgetting about God as our focus is absorbed by whatever it is that we want to do in this world. And can I just say that forgetting God is the most fundamental and also one of the most grave sins that you will read about in the entire Bible. It seems that every Bible character in every nation and Israel's own downfall and their own downward trajectories that they faced were always the result. The first sin was forgetting God. And so think about Saul, whose whole pattern of life, whether it was what God commanded him to do, or setting out to fight a battle not knowing what God wanted him to do in that situation, if God wanted him to go at all. Saul had a pattern of forgetting God, and it destroyed him. And I'm mindful of the book of Judges. What is the kind of constant theme and pattern throughout the entire book of Judges? That they go in there and they defeat many of the Canaanites that are dwelling there, and then suddenly another generation arises that did not remember the Lord. They forgot God. And so what's the result in the book of Judges? The theme at the end of that book is there was no king in those days. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And it turns out doing what's right in our own eyes leads to some pretty nasty stuff, if you've read those final chapters of Judges. Proverbs sums it up this way in Proverbs 14:12. This is a famous memory verse that many of us were taught growing up. There is a way that seems right to a man. We got all our ducks in a row, and we have a vision for the future. And it seems so good and satisfying to us, but notice the warning of Proverbs 14, verse 12. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. That's the problem we see constantly unfolding in the world. We live in a nation that increasingly does not believe in God, that there is an all-powerful being that is looking over mankind and will one day, hold us into account. They either will establish our plans for us or will frustrate our plans if that is according to his will. We know there's a lot of people in this nation that don't live acknowledging such things or believing such things, but the terrible thing is that as God's people, in theory, we know those things, but we don't live like it. And that fact is seen in such a subtle way in this passage of James. That James is talking about forgetting God, and it is so subtle that when James talks about it, we just go, what is the big deal? And yet it's a big deal because we see the problem is that God is forgotten about. It's so common, it's almost undetectable. What is James talking about? Again, in verse 13, he says, today, come now you who say, right? I'm talking to you guys who say these things. Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Clearly, James is just laying out a hypothetical that applied to a lot of people's situation. And what is the problem that James is addressing? Is it their desire to make money? Is it planning itself? Is James saying, you know what, you need to just go with the flow and make absolutely no plans for yourself? No, that is not what James is saying. We wish it were so simple. That's not what James is saying. James is simply saying this: to plan out and map out our lives without reference to God is wrong. It's sinful. It's foolish, and yet it happens all the time. And so James just kind of lays out a very common scenario that still goes on today, where we make plans for the future and where we're going to relocate so that we can make some money. It's a business decision. But James could have used any number of hypotheticals. Next year we're planning to get married, and we're going to be married for a year. We're going to enjoy our marriage together, and then after that year we're going to start having kids. We're going to have 4 kids. And then we're going to buy a house after we've been married for 5 years, and we're going to have 3 beds, 2 baths, right? It's going to have a view. Or we could say something like, I just graduated, and so I'm going to go to college in such and such a place, and the goal is to get a degree in this particular field, and when I get out of college, this is the job that I'm going to get. You can think of any number of hypothetical things that we say at various stages of life. I'm going to put in my 40 years working for this company, and then I'm going to retire. My wife and I, we're going to move to Florida, and we're just going to hang out on the beach every single day. There's just any number of things that we could say that James just as easily could have used as an example here that are making the same point. The point is, we make these plans, and we forget about God. And isn't that the most normal, natural thing in the world, is to make plans? But when we do it without God, what does it become? Plans become this way to exercise control. This way of playing God in our lives. There was once a man who was trying to stick to a diet. Maybe the story's about me, the way that it's going. But he had a favorite bakery. And so he altered his commute so that he wouldn't drive by that bakery. But one morning he accidentally drove by, and he saw all these wonderful pastries, bear claws and donuts and chocolates and cheesecakes sitting in the window, and he was feeling tempted. And so he prayed, Lord, if you want me to have these delicious pastries, create a parking spot right in front of the bakery. And after circling the building 8 times, a spot opened up. And he exclaimed, God is so good. That's a really silly, dumb story. I realize that, but I think that it makes one point really clear. How often is the focus of our lives dominated by what we want? even when there are clear signs that God does not want those things for us. Maybe we get some sort of sign. The parking spot isn't opening up after the 5th run around the block, so maybe that's a sign from God. But more often, when we read Scripture and we come across a text, and it just speaks so plainly to our situation, we're good at just flat out ignoring those things because at the end of the day, we want what we want. And we can find ways of fooling ourselves into thinking that God approves or that his providential hand is guiding it after the fact, when deep down inside we know that it was always about what we want. But our gaze and our thoughts of the future, even though we know that we should look to God, our thoughts for the future and our plans are so easily drawn away from him. And maybe the biggest thing that draws our gaze is the very thing that's alluded to here in James in chapter 4 and verse 13. What is it that is drawing their gaze from God? It is the idea of making a profit. James, even in this example that he gives, this is a huge decision. We're talking about a period of time that is a year, and they're going to relocate to a city, maybe one they're not familiar with. Those two things right there, just spending a year in a new location, that's a major decision that has a huge impact on our spiritual relationship with God, potentially for better or potentially for worse. And so they have a time and a place, and then ultimately they have this goal, which is making a profit. Again, how will it affect them spiritually? How will this decision affect their kids? Is there a group of Christians in this place that they're planning to spend a year for? What about what they're leaving behind? And will anyone suffer from their desertion, which they could otherwise help? James highlights in this hypothetical, none of those things are a concern. They have one primary concern, which is making a profit. Life is full of major decisions at every stage of life. But it seems like some of the most important decisions you and I make in life is when we have the least amount of experience and wisdom. I feel bad for our young people because when you graduate, you know very little, next to nothing about the world, and you're expected to pick out what you're going to do for the next 50 years. Who you're going to marry, where you're going to live, what college you're going to go to. I mean, every major decision, we just drop it in their lap one day when they turn 18 and graduate from high school. Those are huge decisions. And all of them have the potential to impact us spiritually. But how often, with most of those decisions, is the primary concern the very same thing, making a profit? Where will I go to school? Well, which one is most affordable? Which one offers the best scholarship? What will I do for a living? Which degree will allow me to make the most money? Or what career will I enjoy the most? Who will I marry? Right? Some people marry for money. Guys, maybe you just marry who you are most physically attracted to. Where will I live? Well, wherever the money leads me. God doesn't want us to live like that. Just constantly following a paper trail or breadcrumbs of things that we want and that we're absorbed by. And if that's not what dominates our focus, how often is the thing that directs our gaze from seeking God's will just the plain matter of the fact that we face times of crisis very often? And maybe that's the reason you had people making these hypothetical decisions, because they were poor. And they were suffering. And what do we do when we're suffering and we come on hard times and we're in a pinch? That is the moment where we take it on ourselves to play God, to take matters into our own hands. And I know that God wouldn't really necessarily be happy with this, but I got to do what I got to do. This is a temptation that we are faced with in every stage of life, this temptation to forget God. And James says that it's folly. The world treasures self-reliance, which is really what you're left with when you forget God. The world treasures that and says there's nothing greater than independence and being connected to no one and no thing. And yet, what does James do in this passage? He rebukes it. And he uses some pretty strong language. And that's why I read this, I think, what's the big deal? I don't get it. But James makes a huge deal about it. Look at the language he uses to push back on this habit that the Christians had in that day. He goes on in verse 14. He says, you don't know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For your mist that appears for a little time. Verse 16. He says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. Those are two things that the Bible frowns upon. Boasting and arrogance. And then he even goes so far at the end of that verse, in verse 16, he says, all such boasting is evil. That's about as strong a language that James could use. And yet, how many of us do that very same thing? The reason why James uses such strong language is because he is talking about one of the most egregious, fundamental sins, which is forgetting God. He's not just talking about breaking such and such a command, but he's simply talking about forgetting God. Just go about your life. Set goals. Schedule appointments. Do the daily task. Do your homework. And do it all without any regard for God. The Bible tells us throughout that that is wicked. In Psalm 9, verse 16 through 17, this says that the Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. It's the wicked that forget God. In Jeremiah 2 and verse 32, it says, can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. What's Jeremiah saying? There's never been a woman on her wedding day who hasn't gotten dressed up and put on makeup. They make sure that they are prepared to be as presentable as they have ever been. They don't forget. And yet God says, my people have forgotten me. The very thing that makes us presentable before God, which is God himself, his people had forgotten. And so ironically, we kind of have this habit of treating God as transitory. He's like a mist. He's a vapor. He exists on Sundays, and then he's here, and then he's gone. We treat him as insignificant. And people say, who is God? What is God? We treat him as a vapor or mist. And when we do this, when we forget God, except for on Sundays, what do? By default, we assume God's place. To forget God is by default, according to James, to be boastful and arrogant. It is to take God's place, because if God's not real, if God is dead, who is next man in charge of my life? It's me. And so forgetting God, relying on self, planning our life without reference to God, accepting a job without praying, contemplating how it will affect us spiritually, whether or not there's a church in the place where my company relocates me. James says this isn't some little, no big deal problem. But he calls it out and treats it as a grave sin. He calls the attitude behind it evil. Because there is nothing so evil and fundamentally wrong as forgetting God and assuming his place. But I want you to see the problem isn't just that this is wrong or evil, but this is in fact foolish. Which is why we call it the folly of forgetting God. It's not just that this offends God, but the reality is when we forget God, it ruins us. And so I don't know who needs to hear this morning, but whenever God says something is wrong or evil or sinful or foolish, he is saying that that thing is bad for you, that if you do it, eventually it is going to come back to bite you. Forgetting God hurts nobody more than it hurts ourselves. The folly of self-reliance and living without reference to God, essentially playing God ourselves, the problem is that we are not, in fact, God. That's the problem. We try to play God, but we are not God. And so look at how this is laid out in the first verse. They're making these plans. Today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, live a year there, make a profit. As if they know anything. What is the very next thing James says in verse 14? He says, you don't know. You and I don't know even what tomorrow will bring. That we can have our day planned out hour by hour tomorrow, but you know as well as I, it just takes one thing to go wrong for our entire day to be turned upside down. And so there's nothing wrong with making a 5-year plan, or to plan for your future, or to plan for the next year of your life, so long as God is included in it. But I want to say, even then, even when we're in our Bibles and consulting God's will, the reality is we still don't know what tomorrow will bring. I've told you the story before about when I was working in the pipe fitters union and refrigeration. There was a contractor, and he had put in all his years. The day finally came to retire, and him and his wife bought a brand new RV. And it was his last day on the job. The RV was parked there at the job site. Him and his wife were going to ride off into the sunset. And he was looking at something on the roof, and he started coming down the ladder, and he fell off the ladder and landed on his back. And he was paralyzed. All his retirement plans changed in an instant. The problem is, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. But even as that story illustrates, our life is fragile. So I say to the young people, your life is fragile. You are a mist. Here today, gone tomorrow. I don't care if you live for 18 years or for 80 years, the last day of your life will come sooner than you expect. And another example I have to give every time I read this text is a certain individual I was raised with. He preached from this text. He's about 18 years old, and he took a spray bottle up with him to the pulpit, and he said, your life is a mist. And it wasn't but 6 months later, he took on his first career job in a field of construction, and one day working underneath the hot sun, he dropped dead before he was 20. That could happen to any of us. And we know of situations where that has happened. And so who are we to make these plans and to forget about God and to make life as if it's all about us and on us and for us, and failing to acknowledge God and the plans that we make? We know God is in control, and what happens instead, rather than living according to that, we are consumed with worry. Why? Because we think we know. I know what's best. I know how life ought to go. I know what should happen in my life and what should happen in that person's life, and we become eaten up with worry because we are aspiring to an office that only belongs to God. We're aspiring to omniscience, this quality that only God possesses of knowing everything. We fool ourselves into thinking we know, and we become worried because we're concerned God won't get it right. It leads to all sorts of other problems, bitterness, feelings of failure for the same reasons, because we compare our lives to all these other people and how much more successful and better we perceive them to be than us, and what are we doing without even thinking about it? As we consider ourselves a failure and are discouraged, we are aspiring to another quality of God, omnipotence, all-powerfulness. We are assuming that the people who are more successful than us, they got it by their own skill and their own power, and I didn't get it because I'm a miserable failure. And that's just how life works. We are forgetting God. What does the Bible clearly tell us? That it's God who gives the power to get wealth. And so if we forget God, this is life. We will go back and forth between feeling inferior, but then when life is going well, we'll feel superior. Look at everything that I've accomplished for myself, until one day you are crushed by the reality that you don't know. And hopefully on that day we learn that lesson and we take it for heart to heart. And so what's James asking us? He's asking us, reminding us to remember God in our plans. And this is a solution that he tells us and gives us. He says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. The solution that James gives us is a reminder that every plan you and I make in this life is an if plan. Every plan we make is an if. What does James says? He says, you should say if. If the Lord wills. So again, I want to be clear. He doesn't say don't make plans, but he reminds us all of our plans are an if. And the only thing that isn't an if in this life are the Lord's plans and the Lord's will. That means that we have to be malleable, moldable, flexible, which means our plans have to be malleable. Because if we don't, we will find ourselves inevitably crashing into the brick wall of God's will, and we will be broken by it. Broken by worry, anxiousness, bitterness, feelings of inferiority or failure. James says instead we ought to say, if the Lord wills. I want to clarify something with this as well. James isn't giving us a literal formula, kind of a magic charm that I'm going to say if the Lord wills verbally, and then all of life is going to work out. And yet there's people who take this passage that way, and that kind of spiritual language becomes sprinkled in all of our conversations, and we kind of show ourselves to be really pious to the world around us. Some other similar things we say, or how often do people say something like, the Lord is leading me in this particular area of life. He has led me to such and such an occupation, or to such and such a place. Or you know what, the Lord revealed to me, ... Or we go to somebody and we say, you know what, God told me such and such a thing. There's a danger in that. Because ironically, when we do that, we are doing the very thing that James is warning about. Putting ourselves above contradiction. Because when somebody says, hey, God told me, who's going to say, you know what, I don't think that's a good idea. And we're doing the opposite of what James says, which is to not assume the position of God. Isn't that what we're doing when we say those things? That what I'm doing and what God wants, they're always exactly the same. And that is not what the Bible teaches. And so instead we ought to say like what Mordecai said to Esther this morning as we went through that class, as he's looking at this problem that he's facing, and he recognized that Esther has an opportunity to do something. What is it that Mordecai says in chapter 4 and verse 14 of Esther? He says, who knows? Who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It could be. But Mordecai has the humility to say, who knows? And so what if instead we said, you know what, I'm going to do this or that, What if instead we said things like, you know what, this person might be right for me, but we'll see what happens. Or you know what, this job could be a great fit, but we'll see what unfolds. Perhaps maybe we'll move and we'll make a profit, but things could change. You know what, I'm planning to get this degree, but maybe that won't work out. Who knows? God might have other plans. When we speak like that, when we approach life like that, we are remembering. we are remembering that we are not in charge, that it is God who establishes our footsteps. Proverbs 19, verse 20 says, "Many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." Proverbs 16, verse 9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." So isn't it amazing that when you really boil this down, whatever we are given, when we wake up each day, number one, we understand that whatever we're given and faced with today, it's better than hell, isn't it? Which is what we deserve. But every single day that we stand up and arise from our deads is by the grace of God. It is God that lets us stand and breathe and move and have our being. And so James says something very interesting. He concludes in verse 17. He says, "So," which tells us this connected with what he's just said, "whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." Some of your versions say "therefore." And I've always been puzzled by that. Because a lot of times when somebody preaches on this passage, it's disconnected from what precedes. And we talk about there's sins of commission, those are sins that you actually do, and then there's sins of omission is what this passage talks about, where it's you know the right thing and you just don't do it. And so we'll maybe make a point about the Good Samaritan and all those guys that walked by and didn't help that person left for dead. And there's a point to be made there, but I think James has something more specific and foundational in mind. What is the sin of omission he is telling us to avoid? What is the right thing we know to do, but fail to do it and therefore is sin when that's the case? The sin of omission is living life without remembering God, without acknowledging his power and sovereignty over our lives. You know, the great irony is that you and I, according to James, are perfectly forgettable. We are insignificant. We are missed, is what he says. Here today, gone tomorrow. Our existence is transitory and fragile. We're vapors. And yet, what does the Bible tell us? What does the gospel teach? Isaiah 49, verse 15, "Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you." God did not forget us, even though we're perfectly forgettable, which is why he sent his son to die in our place, so that we are not fragile, but conquerors. Our existence is not transitory, but eternal, if we remember him. The wicked who forget God, they go down to the grave, is what Psalm 9 says. Psalm 9 also says, "The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble, and those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you." And so if you're young, just graduated or getting ready to graduate high school or college, you're thinking about the future, or if you're middle-aged, or if you're old, do not forget God, because he has not forgotten you, so that even if all your plans fall apart, it will be okay, because God's plan still stands. If you're here this morning and you want to have the comfort of knowing that God's plan is working out for your best interests, you can do that today by being baptized when you're included in God's plan to be raised from the dead. What a glorious thought. If you have any spiritual needs at this time, perhaps we can pray for you. You can talk to me in the back while we stand and sing the song of invitation.